Hey guys, my name is Jacob Pressage, and today we're going to talk to you a little bit about Middle Age European torture. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the presentation. So, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the church's role in torture, who got tortured, the reasons for torture, and most interesting, the devices and tactics for torture. So the church's role in torture was actually a pretty significant one. It was first implemented by the church, and it's important to know that torture was actually seen as a legitimate form of justice and a way to provoke confessions from people. Pope Innocent IV created the papal bull, which was titled Ad Extirpanda. And according to Linda Alchin, who writes a bunch of articles for students to use about history and things of that nature, but specifically torture in the Middle Ages, she claims that it was actually allowed the use of torture to provoke a confession and especially to be a legitimate punishment. Um, she wrote a bunch of other things about it and whatnot, which I used to construct my paper, but for simplicity reasons, to go ahead and make the time stamp, we're gonna just go ahead and briefly touch on some things. But the church's goal was to exterminate heresy throughout Europe and any thoughts that had to do with anything against the church, basically. So the church used torture to go ahead and try and keep their, I guess, their people in check and to keep their brand as they wanted it to be. So with that, let's move forward into who was tortured. So torture was mainly used on people who were thought to be against the church or against basic laws, honestly. So heretics, people who deviated from orthodoxy, so people who were against the church again, thieves and other criminals such as murderers and things like that. But the one thing that I found pretty interesting was monarchs. They utilized it pretty much against people who committed treason and almost exclusively that, which I thought was kind of crazy how the church just went ahead and used it for reasons XYZ, but monarchs pretty much kept it just for treason and high offenses and things of that nature. Um, but with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move into actually who was tortured or why people were tortured, rather, now that we know who was tortured. So, according to McKenna Bennett, who actually wrote an article very similar to mine, I used her paper to help construct my paper, um, and put together some parts and pieces on mine that sounded better, uh, just with a little bit of some of her information from her sources than what I found from mine. But basically, she said the main reasons for torture revolved around treason, adultery, which we'll get into a little bit later, theft, as mentioned earlier, along with murder, and again, to provoke a confession. And a lot of times the church used it as a message to other people about what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. I actually read some articles that you could be tortured for something as simple as just being drunk on a Sunday in public. Could get you wound up in a torture dungeon. So the thing I concluded from all this was basically in those times you could get tortured for pretty much anything, which I kind of find to be unfair. But then again, that's a different time period than what we're living in now. So I thought, my viewpoint might be different if I was living in that time period. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and get into what I think is the most interesting slash gruesome of the entire PowerPoint. That is the strategies and devices that they use to torture people. So with that being said, if you take a look at number one, the stripado or the stripato, however you want to pronounce it, was a device used to hang people basically, but they weren't hung around their necks. They were actually hung by their wrists. They were tied together behind their back and then hoisted up in the air, therefore causing their shoulders to dislocate and severely rip any tendons up in that area and cause a whole lot of pain. And not many people died from this, but honestly, if I were in that position, I think I'd want to be dead after that. And all the excruciating pain that came with it. Sometimes weights were even added to people's ankles just to ramp up the severity of it and the damages done to the person. So number two is the donkey. So if you look in the top right hand corner, you'll see a man straddling what I would best call a sawhorse with a triangular top. That triangle on top was obviously pointed, like most triangles are, and it was made out of either wood or metal. More often than not, wood. It's the material they had on hand, and people were forced to sit on that and straddle that, oftentimes with weights tied around their ankles to, again, intensify the pain and whatnot. But this did damage to, the genital area, the anus, and things of that nature. And a lot of times people caught infections off this because they would never clean it or sanitize it. So a lot of times there would be blood, fecal matter, urine, anything on that was left from the person before. That's a lot of times how infection would then, build up over time, and a lot of people got infected based off this and died. So it was a pretty deadly thing, even though it may not seem too deadly, but it's definitely something that I would not want to encounter myself. I honestly hope no one would have to encounter that, but as we know, people in the past have. So then, with that being said, we're moving on to number three, which is called the rack. In my opinion, out of the five that I have on this page, this is probably the most gruesome and devastating one that I read about. It was actually really hard to stomach it, trying to type it out. It was pretty gross. But basically, someone was laid down like so, tied by both ankles and arms, to be into like a star position kind of thing, with pillars that, when rolled in the opposite direction, would pull on the person's arms and legs, and it would pull to the point of, anywhere from muscles being severed to joints snapping to bones cracking to ligaments breaking, anything like that. It obviously made a disgusting noise that a lot of people were made, to sit and witness when they were thought to, potentially be worthy of this device. So a lot of times they would be forced to watch this and listen to this happen before even making to it themselves to try and provoke a confession on a crime or their heresy or things of that nature. So a lot of people died from this, as imaginable, but not all of them. But one thing's for sure is that not everybody really healed completely after experiencing this. Many weren't even able to walk properly afterwards, like number two as well. And it was just something that's honestly extremely barbaric and something that's kind of unbelievable, really. But with that being said, we're going to go on to number four, which is the Judas chair. It's a lot like number two, the donkey, except this is like a pointed pyramid that's targeting mainly the anus, or if you're a woman, the vagina. But basically, you were tied with your legs together and your arms behind your back, strapped up in the position, and made to sit on that pointed, pyramid looking thing, sometimes made out of wood, sometimes made out of metal. Again, just all depends on what was at hand. But again, it was not sanitized at all, so infection was carried and transferred on that pretty frequently. Um, but it was just a really gruesome thing. A lot of times people would sit on it for hours and then take it off for an hour just to be tossed right back on an hour later to help enhance the length of the torture, therefore the overall pain. Which is something that's pretty gruesome and barbaric, again, like everything else on the screen. But it is something that happened, and it's something worth mentioning. And then number five is the last one we're going to talk about, and it was geared specifically for women. It's the breast ripper. So it was attached to the wall while those two prongs were dug into the side of the woman's breast while she was abruptly yanked away from it, therefore ripping her breast clean off her body. And this was used for women that, either committed adultery or aborted a child when they weren't supposed to, or got a divorce or did something against her husband or anything like that of that nature. This was used to remedy that, which I think is pretty crazy and pretty barbaric, like everything else. But again, different times, different measures, I guess. So it's just one of those things. Like torture, like I said, it was implemented by the church, which is pretty odd in my opinion because the church is all about love and hope and things of that nature. In my opinion, if religion wasn't even a thing, then nor would war, because it seems like most violence is actually rooted from religion. And this is actually a great argument point to even begin and start on. Um, but at the end of the day, torture, especially in the medieval times, is something that happened. It's history. It's a part of us. It's something that we need to recognize and understand. That way, we don't allow history to repeat itself, and it's something that we really can't take lightly. It's fascinating to learn about, although it can be a little gruesome at times. But overall, I think it's something that would benefit us to learn about. Therefore, we don't let anything similar to this happen in the future. So that's the rest of my presentation, guys. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.